Alrighty, hello class, and welcome to Let's Make Music, the music educational channel where we bring music lessons to you from home. Once again, I'm your instructor, Cody Hanna. I'm a multi-instrumentalist of about 15, 16 years now, and I'm trying to take whatever knowledge I have and give it back to you folks. So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about basic music theory, and we're in lesson 1, and we're going to talk about standard musical notation. In this lesson, we're going to learn what music is and how and why we read and write music the way that we do in Western music. So first of all, what is music? This is a complicated question. And if you ask a bunch of different musicians, you're probably going to get a bunch of slightly different answers. But the general consensus that I've found around music is that it's an organized collection of sounds used to create art. This is, like all other forms of art, subjective and varied across the globe. People, different cultures and different kinds of people react to music and engage with music in very different ways. So this is a very, very broad way of describing it without trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the different kinds of music. Because today and through the rest of this series, we're kind of just going to focus on the Western music tradition. So how do we read and write music? Most Western music is written using standard musical notation, and this is a system that we as musicians and composers have come up with through the course of music history to essentially have a standardized way of communicating our musical ideas. Because if we come up with a piece in our head and we try and write it down using a system that nobody else knows, we're not going to be able to find performers who are going to be able to interpret that information into recreating the music. So we need to have some kind of standardized language for how we go about reading and writing music. And in Western music, we call this standard musical notation. So it all starts with the staff, and the staff in music is essentially the roadmap that we're following when we're reading a piece of music. So we see it's made up of 5 lines, 4 spaces in between, and if you need to, when we're writing music, you can also add ledger lines above or below the staff to interpret higher or lower notes. When we look at the staff with each of these lines and spaces, hopefully you guys can see my cursor. If we were to start with a note right here on this first space, that would be the note F, and move up to the next line, up to what our note G would be, we're moving by what's called steps. And so you'll probably hear this a lot in this series, the term whole steps and half steps. We're going to start with just whole steps. F to G would be a whole step. So you're seeing it as you go up the lines and the spaces of the staff that we're moving by primarily steps. Now there's a couple weird spots like between E and F and B and C where we're actually moving by a half step, but we'll get to that in just a second. For right now, just know that if we're going up the lines and spaces of the staff, or if we're going down the lines and spaces of the staff, we're moving by steps primarily. So our first clef that we need to learn is treble clef, and it's also known as a G clef because if you can see here, it kind of wraps around the G line of the treble clef staff. So see how that kind of lines up with this note G here? And the treble clef is typically used for instruments and voices that are in a higher register. So, you know, your flutes, your clarinets, that sort of thing will generally read in treble clef. If we look at the lines here, we have on the lines from lowest to highest, we have E, G, B, D, and F. And then in the spaces in between, they represent the notes F, A, C, and E. There's a ton of mnemonic devices out there for learning the notes of the staff. I was taught when I was in music to do Every Good Boy Does Fine, but I also know there's a couple other ones, and then for the spaces in between, just face. It's pretty easy to remember. So the next clef we're going to talk about, and we won't talk about like, you know, alto clef and tenor clef, but for right now we're going to focus on treble and bass. And for the bass clef, which is also known as an F clef because same spiel with the G clef, this is wrapping around our F note right there. And we use a bass clef for obviously instruments that are more in a bass register, in a lower pitched register. So things like tubas, trombones, bass singers, all of those use bass clef in some form. So I think those are treble and bass are really the most important ones when you first start out learning music. So as you can see, just like with the treble clef, we have lines and spaces, but they represent different notes for bass clef. So really you can shift it down and think of it that way. Like in treble clef, we started E, G, B, D, F. This one is G, B, D, F, A. But, another mnemonic device you can use is good boys do fine always. And then the one for the spaces I was taught when I was a kid was all cows eat grass, which is true. Um, so yeah, the bass clef is really just a shifted version of the treble clef, but it's good to know the notes of the bass clef staff and the treble clef staff. All right, accidentals. So we can put notes on the lines and the spaces of the staff, and that generally represents our diatonic notes. If you were looking at a piano keyboard, that would be all the white notes. But what we can also do in music is separate the tones in between two of the white notes to get a flatted or sharped note. And that's when we get into talking about half steps as opposed to whole steps. So like if we look at this first one on the right over here, this is a sharp sign. So this is on the note F here. If we were to play this on a piano and just play the note F, we'd be playing a wrong note. So we have to raise this. If we see this symbol right here, we have to raise this by a half step or a semitone. So instead, we would play the next black note, if we were playing on a piano, above that. So instead of F, we'd be playing an F sharp. Now, the alternate is true for flats, this next symbol right here in the middle. If we see a flat symbol by a note, we have to lower it by a half step. And in this case, we have it on the note F, which I think this was just used for an example, but F flat is kind of a contentious note because it's enharmonically equivalent to E natural. And all you have to know about enharmonic equivalency is that they're the same pitch but different note names depending on the context. But for this note right here, F flat, we could go to the piano keyboard and go to F, find the note F, and then go one key down. And because there's not a black key in between the notes E and F, we would just play E. So even though E and F are both diatonic notes, it is a half step between them. But we'll get into more into that a little bit later. And then this last one over here, furthest to the left, this is a natural sign. And what this does is it cancels out any sharps or flats that were in that measure. Or alternatively, if there are flats and sharps in the key signature of the piece that you're playing in, and you see a natural sign, it cancels it out for the duration of that measure. Important thing to know, naturals, if they're just organically written next to the notes like these ones, they only last for that one measure. So the next measure, if you saw the same note, like this F that didn't have a natural sign by it, you would still play it the way that the key signature tells you to. But if you see a natural sign next to it, you play it as just the diatonic version of that note. All right, tempo. So tempo, in a nutshell, is just the speed of a piece of music. It's how fast or how slow we're supposed to play a piece of music, depending on what the composer wanted. And you can usually find this in the top left corner of your music if you're given a piece of music. It's measured in beats per minute, and we'll get into beats and measures of time and things like that in just a second. But just know that when you're practicing and you have a metronome with you, the place where you find how fast or how slow to set your metronome is this little symbol right here. And yeah, you can usually find it right at the beginning of a piece of music. Tempo is not set in stone. Tempo can fluctuate, it can change drastically in an instant. But there will always be an indicator of how you do that. So you'll either see something like this, Or sometimes the composer will just put a Italian operatic music term like adagio or allegro, and that will give you a general gist of the style and the pace that you're supposed to be taking your music. But for the most part, you'll usually see one of these. All right, measures. Measures, or bars as they're sometimes called, are a segment of musical time. So instead of just looking at a staff with notes dotted all around it with nothing to separate them into digestible chunks, uh, we have measures as a way to break down our music into more easily digestible parts. And we do that by separating them by bar lines, which you can see here. So each bar corresponds with a set number of beats. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a second when we talk about time signature. But just know each bar is broken up by how many beats are in that bar, and it's the same throughout. So if you're in a specific time signature, which again we'll talk about, you're playing a set number of beats for each bar. And yeah, time signatures. Okay, so the most common one you're going to come across is this first one, 4/4, and we'll use that as an example. So a time signature is a musical symbol that's made of two stacked numbers that tells us the number of beats in each measure and what note value gets the beat. And the way that we dissect this is if we look at this first one, 4/4, we can look at the top number and see that we have 4 beats in a measure. So that's where you get the number of beats in a measure from the top number and what note value gets the beat. So there's a 4 on the bottom, so I know that the quarter note is going to get the beat. So just from looking at this time signature, I can see that there are 4 beats in a measure and the quarter note gets a beat. So each measure should be 4 quarter notes long. Which brings us into basic note values. And right here, I put up a diagram of what's called the rhythm tree, and it just kind of shows you how we break down note durations in music. The most basic one that we need to talk about first off is the whole note. So whole note, as you can see, it's just represented by an empty little ovular shape. And you see 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how many beats it gets. So a whole note, generally, when we see it in music, gets 4 beats. We can break that up into the next tier, half notes, where we have again, a hollow ovular shape, but this time it has a stem. And that's an important distinction between the whole note and the half note, is whole notes do not have a stem, ever. Half notes are the first note that we get that has a stem. So you can see down here, each one is 1, 2, 3, 4. Break it down again, and we get quarter notes. And a quarter note looks like a half note, but just filled in. And we get 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're each individually a beat. You can break those up again into eighth notes, where you get 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and you can see them with stems individually in this first beat, but we can also beam those stems together. And what that looks like is these next two. So if we had 2 eighth notes next to each other, generally, if they're on the same beat, we'll beam them together. So we have 2 and here, beam together, and then this next one, we can beam 4 or 5 or 6, depending on the time signature we're in. We can beam these eighth notes together in a way that we wouldn't for quarter notes, half notes, or whole notes. And the same thing is true down here for 16th notes. It's just another half of an eighth note. So we would count that as 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a, 4E and a. And you can see we have the individual ones here and some 16th notes beamed together here. And the 16th note looks just like the 8th note beamed together, except there's an extra little line, which hopefully you can see. And as we break down our beats into smaller and smaller fractions, we kind of just keep adding these lines. You generally won't see anything much more broken down than a 16th note or a 32nd note. In the most extreme of cases, like I've been doing music for 15 years now, and I still have never come across like a 64th note. Um, but yeah, so you can see that generally this is where we're going to stop in our basic music theory lessons is 16th notes. And so that same note duration, note value thing is true for rests. And rests in music are when we don't play. It's periods of silence. So, you know, we use rests as a way to breathe if we're a singer or if we're a wind player or, you know, just in times when other groups are playing. But you can see that the whole rest, half rest, quarter rest, it follows the same pattern. The symbols are just a little different. So this first one is a whole rest, and you can see that it looks like a little upside down hat going down. Half rest, you just flip it back up, and it's the same note values as half notes. Quarter rest, I really don't even know how to describe some of these symbols, but if you just take a look real closely, you can see that they're it's kind of like an etched lightning bolt 3 shape. And then we have eighth rests, which I think my music teacher back in middle school used to tell us it looks like Elvis because it has a little curly thing. And then we have 16th rest, which is just same spiel as the 16th note. It just adds an extra little flag to it. All right, dots and ties. So you know how in pitches we talked about accidentals and raising or lowering by a semitone and how that changes the notes that we're given? We have a similar concept in rhythmic music with dots and ties. So this first one, we have a little chart of dotted notes. So what a dot does is when you see a dot next to a note, you need to extend the duration of that note by 1.5 times its original length. So like, for example, if we had a dotted half note, realistically, it would be a half note plus a quarter note. So it's 1.5 times the length. So it would be for 3 beats instead of 2 beats for the original. Same thing is true of the quarter note. If we saw a dotted quarter note, we know it gets 1.5 beats because 1.5 times the quarter note plus an eighth note. And you generally won't see these a whole lot, but sometimes you do. If you see it with 2 dots next to it, it's just further breaking down the way that we extend that note. So that would be a beat plus a half a beat plus a quarter of a beat. Generally won't see those too much, but when you do, just know that that's how you break that down. And then ties. Okay, so ties do a similar thing to dots, except they conjoin the values of 2 notes. And typically you'll see these with 2 of the same note together. They'll be tied to extend their duration. And usually you'll see this is because it's going over a bar line. So if you want a note to hold out over a measure into the next measure, typically you'll see a tie on the note towards the end of the first measure. If it's the same note, we call that just a tie. But if you see 2 notes that are tied together that are different pitches, generally we'll call that a slur. And yeah, as you can see here, we have a half note tied to a quarter note. Realistically, that's just 3 beats, right? Because the half note is worth 2 beats, quarter note is worth 1 beat, so it equals 3 beats total. Same spiel for a quarter note and an eighth note. It's just 3 eighth notes together and going down the line. So it's just a way that we use to signify rhythms that are generally a little bit syncopated and a little bit off the beat. But dots and ties can be really helpful for different kinds of rhythmic ideas. So it's really important to know those. And that brings us to the end of our first lesson. Great work, guys. Please go take a look at these slides. Try and learn at least your note names in treble and bass clef, and learn your rhythm tree of notes and rests. And I think that would be a good basis to start with our next lesson. So until next time, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more music lessons. I super appreciate you guys doing that. It helps me out so much to keep bringing you guys lessons. and keep practicing, keep learning, and let's make music. Have a good one.